Começamos aqui o podcast da Revista Tema Livre. A seguir, a entrevista que o historiador Robert Darnton, de Harvard, concedeu ao historiador Fábio Ferreira, da UF. Por fim, não deixe de acessar o nosso site, revistatemalivre.com, e confira entrevistas, artigos acadêmicos e muito mais. Revista Tema Livre, desde 2002, fazendo história.
Primeiramente, eu gostaria de falar sobre a sua carreira. Como surgiu? Por que você escolheu fazer história?
Well, now that I'm in old age, I can look back on my youth and try to make sense of it. But when I was young, the future was very unclear, and I knew one thing: I wanted to be a newspaper reporter. So I began at an early age, really, writing news stories. I even, believe it or not, had a byline in the New York Times when I was 4 years old. Of course, I couldn't write at that age, but a friend of my father was killed as a war correspondent in World War II. And one of his friends from the Times took me around Washington when I was 4 years old and took down my baby talk and then transcribed it, and it made an amusing article. For example, I could not say Pentagon, I said penny gone, things like that. So from the very beginning, I expected I would be a journalist. And I worked on school newspapers. I did a kind of boot camp training in Newark, New Jersey, which is a very tough city, training police reporting. In the old days, all journalists had to learn to cover police headquarters. So I did that in Newark during a summer while I was in college. And I continued. I got a scholarship to go to Oxford. And during vacations, I worked for the New York Times in its London bureau. Not that I was particularly gifted, but the New York Times wanted to do me favors because I was the son of one of their reporters who was killed in the war. Well, when I was in Oxford, I did a historical degree because that seemed to me more interesting than anything else. And then it got more interesting and more interesting. And soon I fell in love with history. And I didn't know what to do because I was supposed to be a reporter. And after I finished my PhD, which I did very rapidly and enjoyed enormously, I went back to the New York Times and worked again as a crime reporter in New York City. And then I realized I really wanted to do history. I had just fallen in love with history, and writing endless stories about bank holdups and fires and murders and so on really was not very satisfying. I knew, of course, that someday I would go on to more important stories, but the idea of a breaking story, writing 500, 800 words about an event that comes and goes, it just wasn't satisfying compared with the deep study of history in the archives. Because in Oxford, they were, so to speak, British empiricists. And they said, don't worry about methodology. They never used the word. We don't deal in theory. Go to the archives, find something history is something interesting, and write it up. So, in other words, my answer to your question is I never intended to be a historian. I just fell in love with history without meaning to, and I've lived happily ever after. Well, what I was trying to explain is that I never set out to be an historian. That was not my original idea. It simply happened because I fell in love with actually doing history, with going into the archives, opening boxes, pulling out paper that no one had read for 200 years and finding out what life was like in the past. So I think it was this sense of contact with other human beings who lived long ago and whose lives I could enter into that I found fascinating.
Eu vou te pedir para contar um pouco para a gente como surgiu o seu interesse pela França.
I am not French. I have no French relatives. I learned French fairly late in life, not as a boy, young boy. So people always ask me, why are you interested in France? My answer is France is interesting. It's wonderful. The food, the cafes, the cathedrals, the beauty of the countryside. France is irresistible. But the deeper reason is when you get into French archives, you discover that they are endless, and the possibilities of really studying things up close and doing fine grained research are tremendous. So the truth is that I fell in love with France not just by going to cafes and admiring the women, but by actually immersing myself in the archives. The French have a particular archival system. Once you understand the way it works, you can do wonderful things with it. And there are always surprises. Um, I mean, it's hard to describe the experience, but if you sit in the Archives Nationales in Paris or any departmental archive, you follow a series. There are famous series like the F7 series, which has to do with the revolutionary police, or the Q series, which has to do with the parliaments, and so on and so on. You can follow the series and you fill out a bulletin hoping that you would find something that would be of relevance to the problem you're studying. A box arrives on your desk. You undo a ribbon on the side of the box, lift open the lid, and there are folders piled up. You take out a folder, open it up, and you might see a series of memoranda or letters arranged, well, in no particular order, but often chronological, and you start reading. Somehow, out of this very raw material, you need to find a story or to discover something important. And that is endlessly thrilling. Of course, there's a lot of hard work. You could go for days and days without finding anything terribly interesting. But when I began, which was, let's see, 1961, a long time ago, there were no computers. We just had index cards. In fact, I have some here on my desk. That's what I did. I filled out index cards looking at the manuscripts and trying to find a thread, trying to find a line of connection from one document to another that I thought I could turn into a story. So it's that sensation, the sensation of contact with other lives hundreds of years ago through the physical document that I found thrilling. And that's what France had to offer. Now, it's true that when I arrived at Oxford, I had to choose, I had a scholarship, I had to choose a course of study. And the one that interested me most went from the 17th to the 19th century, what we call today the early modern period. France is the central power at that time, although there are many other important countries. But France, Paris is the capital of the 18th century. That's where exciting things happen. That's where the philosophers gathered to make the Enlightenment. and where the revolution broke out. So my training in Oxford was in the classic subjects such as the history of ideas, the Enlightenment, the history of the revolution, and so on. And therefore, I did, of course, have a basis in formal study, but it was all new to me. And in Harvard, where I had been a student before I went to Oxford, I studied American history and literature, nothing like French things. So it grew on me and it was fun. So I found that history was a kind of, it was a pleasure, but it was really like detective work. I would follow clues through documents. And in fact, one of the books I wrote, it's called Poetry and the Police, is a detective story. I discovered opening a box in the archives, in this case, the Bibliothèque de l'Arsenal in Paris. I discovered one folder that had nothing to do with what I was looking for, but had an intriguing title on the top of the folder, L'affaire des 14, the affair of the 14. What was that? I wondered. I'd never heard of the affair of the 14, so I started looking at it, and I discovered that it was a police investigation. There were actual detectives in 1749 who were ordered from the top of the government to find the man who wrote a poem whose first lines were Monstre dans la noire furie, monster whose black fury. That's all they knew. But the police had about 3,000 spies who circulated around Paris, who sat in cafes, who listened for things. And after a while, one of the spies discovered a student reciting this poem. The student was arrested. They asked him where he got the poem. He explained he got it from, let's call him A. A got it from B. They arrested B. B said he got it from C. They arrested C, and so on until they had arrested 14 people. And it became possible to follow the circulation of this poem from one person to another. While following it, um, uh, I discovered that one of the persons said, yes, I got this poem, call him X, from Y, but I also got other poems from MLN. And soon the police were tracking 5 poems that were recited, memorized, and sung through the kind of middle classes and lower classes of Paris. In other words, it became clear that I could grasp something that had eluded historians before, is very difficult to get a hold of, namely oral communication. So I followed the detective works of the police as a kind of detective myself, my purpose being to understand oral communication and networks as they actually functioned in Paris around 1750. One of the surprises in this detective work was the importance of music, because people wrote words to tunes, and everyone carried in their heads a repertory of tunes, just the way you do. I bet you have tunes in your head that most people in Rio also know. You could hum them or whistle them or sing them. Similarly, Parisians around 1750 all knew certain simple tunes, and they could improvise new words to the old tunes. So singing turned out to be a way of communicating political messages. And songs were a kind of newspaper, because real newspapers with news in them did not exist at this time. So I began to see Paris as full of songs. with street corner singers, professional singers, people singing at work, a city just alive with sung music. And it was so important as a means of communication that the government, the police, tried to control it. Well, that I found to be a fascinating story, but it illustrates what I'm trying to say, the joy of surprises in the archives, of coming upon something you were not looking for, but which can open up an aspect of history that was unstudied or new.
Há pouco, você mencionou sobre a experiência de se pesquisar nos arquivos, e aí eu te pergunto, dentro desse nosso contexto, com a tecnologia, computador, como é que a informática mudou a pesquisa na área de história?
Well, we live in a completely different world from the world I inhabited when I was a student beginning to work in the archives in Paris. After all, the internet was only invented in 1991. And well, the internet goes back longer than that, but the World Wide Web was invented in 1991. And from that time on, we've been uh, changing our means of communication spectacularly. So the change, I think you would agree, has been as revolutionary as it was in the 1450s when Gutenberg invented movable type. I even think it's been greater than Gutenberg's so called revolution. How has that affected historical research? Well, one obvious way is you now have access to documents that were beyond your reach in the past. You don't have to go to Paris in order to consult books, pamphlets, and even archives. Now, the archives are not yet digitized. They never will be because they are enormous. They're, in my view, almost infinite. You know, I think of Borges and the libraries he describes in his novels. Well, the French archives are like that. They go on forever and you could get lost in them. Key books are available. And I use the internet every day in consulting pamphlets and books that I could not reach in my own library. So that's one step. But the other things are more interesting and less obvious. I described the affair of the 14 to you just now. Uh, that, that also illustrates the point I'm trying to make because uh, I asked myself, what did these songs sound like? Well, you can't capture sound in the archives, but they all said written to the tune of. So I would find a manuscript, get the text of the sung poem, and then I went to the musicology department of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and I I found keys to the actual music. You could look up a title or the first word in a song and then get the actual musical annotation. A friend of mine who is a cabaret singer in Paris, Hélène Delaveau, agreed to record the songs according to the original music. And the recording is available on a website to the reader, to anyone, but to the reader of my book. At the end of the book, I give the text of 10 songs in French and then in English, and the reader can click onto the web and hear them sung. So it's as if you can hear the past. Not perfectly, of course, because Hélène Delaveau is a very good singer, and most of these street corner chansonneurs were pretty miserable singers, but you get the idea. And to hear the words as parts of tunes gives them a much richer meaning. So that's a second example of how the digital age has transformed our understanding. We can now, it's a third point, write new kinds of books, books that have sound and images and video, interviews, all sorts of things available. And so we really are working in a multimedia world. And I think that the writing of history is going to involve all kinds of experiences that had not been possible before. However, I say that, but there are not many examples of real breakthroughs in this sort of thing. And for the moment, I have the impression that most important history writing is actually quite similar to what it was 50 years ago. So I'm waiting. And now you would probably ask me about big data. Of course, big data opens up endless possibilities. We can do word searches. We can find out how many times Robespierre used the word liberty in his speeches and what the philological context was of his use of the word liberty. It turns out it was rather oppressive. So, yes, we can do things through word searches and also through finding quantitative patterns in all kinds of documents. Uh, that I think is wonderful. But again, I would ask the question, can you give me an example of the use of big data in history that has really changed our conception of the past? I haven't found one yet in the field I'm studying. It will come, I'm sure, and I'm looking forward to it, but I don't think that we suddenly have arrived at a new perception of the past. I think we're still at a beginning technological stage, and what we need is to find it realized in actual historical works.
Você pode nos falar um pouco sobre a história do livro e quais as perspectivas futuras para o livro?
Well, of course, you could begin by asking, what is a book? It turns out I only discovered this very recently that Immanuel Kant wrote an essay, What is a Book? He wrote a famous essay, What is Enlightenment? But soon after that, he wrote another one. And his answer was a book basically is a voice, is a form of expression of an author. It's not a thing. And therefore, Kant did not favor copyright in the sense of literary property. It's very interesting because there was a big debate at this time about literary property. It's one that ran through the 18th and the 19th century, and it's still going on today. Kant's position was quite unusual for a great thinker. He did not believe in an absolute right to literary property. Well, I'm straying a little from your question, excuse me. But what I wanted to say is a book is, well, it's many things. It's, of course, a form of communication, but books went back to the very far past. Uh, we have what we can call legitimately books that are, well, I think some of them are almost 2,000 years before Christ. Very, very ancient epics that were, of course, at first oral, oral poems, as in the case of Homer, but that there were epics in um, what is now the Middle East, in Babylonia, that are very, very, very old.
Mhm.
So books were, you could say that when Homer sang his Odyssey and sang his Iliad, he was making a book. In fact, if you ask what does the verb to publish mean, and you look it up in conventional dictionaries, in English, the great Oxford Dictionary of the English language, it begins by this definition: to publish is to render public. How do you make something public? Well, you could make it public by talking, by singing, by performing. And I ran across, again, in the archives, uh, a very interesting description of what the government called the publication of the peace of 1748. The peace, the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle after the War of the Austrian Succession, the peace was published. So how did they publish it? I, I found this really interesting. There was a huge parade of several hundred men on horseback and marching with a kind of band, drums and trumpets. And they spent a day going around Paris and stopping at key places, the Place de Grève, the Place Maubert, and so on. They would then beat the drum, blow the trumpet, and a royal official would read the text of the treaty. It would take him a long time, and people would stand around and watch. They would be interested, or maybe they weren't. Maybe they would just continue selling carrots and lettuce. But this is what it was to publish the piece. So publishing is making public, and there are many different ways of doing it. Um, and therefore, I think the history of books should actually concern every way. Um, we should study the reading of books, the oral reading, as well as the silent reading. We should go back and try to look at the form of the book, uh, going back if as far as we can to imagine the wax tablets that were used by Cicero when he gave speeches in ancient Rome, medieval manuscripts, and well, book historians have dealt with all forms of communication. Now, it's true that a few moments or periods stand out. And so we can divide book history into a period when you had to read what were known as the volumen, that is, scrolls, which you unscrolled in order to read. And then around the time of the birth of Christ, the first century AD, the uh, this new invention, a book that you could read by turning pages, began to spread at first through Christians and then later in general. So that was a revolution as you took in books by perceiving the printed page. Um, there were other important moments, but of course, Gutenberg's invention of movable type is crucial. And the links between the books themselves and the surrounding social context is something that most book historians have explored. So, when is it that you get a real large general reading public, what the French call le grand public? Um, well, I think it didn't happen until the middle of the 19th century, the second half of the 19th century. That's when you had mass education. You could print books more cheaply, and doing so by um, using steam power presses, and there was cheap paper made from wood pulp rather than from rags. Things came together by 1850 to create a new world for books. So I'm rambling around a little bit, but what I'm trying to say is a broad view of what a book is and how communication takes place can punctuate the history of books according to the technology, according to the social milieu, and according to, well, the movement of ideas too. So I don't want to neglect that. Now, what the future of the book will be, I don't know. I honestly hesitate. I find it hard enough to predict the future of the past. To predict the future of the future is difficult to say, but obviously we will be dealing with digital communication to a very great degree. And as I said, certainly we will be using the digital media to mix different kinds of experience in, including hearing things as well as seeing them.
Para finalizarmos, eu vou te pedir para falar com a gente, para falar para o público, sobre o seu trabalho em Harvard.
Well, I became the director of the Harvard University Library to my great surprise. I never intended to become a librarian, just as originally I never intended to become an historian. But I've always loved books and libraries. In fact, I found as I was teaching originally in Princeton University that I was drawn into the world of books, partly by serving on the university library committee, then being on the board of the Princeton University Press. That led to meetings in New York. The New York Public Library asked me to join it as a trustee of the library. So I was in the middle of the activities of a great, great public library. And I was also made a trustee of the Oxford University Press in the USA and got involved in the publishing industry. And soon I found I was just fascinated by the contemporary world of books while I was working on the history of books back in the 18th century. I think perhaps that's why Harvard thought, for some reason, I might be a good librarian. In any case, the phone rang and it was Harvard saying, "Will you come and become the head of the library?" And of course, I said yes. I was very happy at Princeton, although I've been a student at Harvard and I love Harvard. But I thought you can really make a difference. The Library of Harvard is the oldest in North America. It's the largest, except for the Library of Congress in the world, really. Well, the British Museum, the Library of Congress, but then Harvard, a university library. It's existed since 1638. So this tiny academy um, was founded only 2 years before, 1636. It was minuscule. The country had only been settled for 15 or 16 years. But the settlers, dissidents from England, thought you must have education. They created a tiny academy. And then in 1638, a man called John Harvard, we know almost nothing about him, died. But he had brought with him to this wilderness 400 books. He had no children, and he left the books in his will to this tiny academy, which suddenly overnight had the largest library in North America. 400 books. Amazing. So it changed its name to Harvard in honor of him. And the college and then the university grew around this core of books. So I find that a wonderful story because the library is the heart and soul of the university. And being invited to help that heart beat and to send intellectual energy into every part of this great university was a wonderful opportunity. So I said yes. I arrived there and I became involved in all sorts of projects, including many projects to digitize things and to especially because this I saw as my main mission to share the intellectual wealth of Harvard with the rest of the world. That you can do by digitizing. So instead of it being a closed collection of books and manuscripts and prints for the elite, the faculty and students of Harvard, it opened up to the whole world. Now, that's a complicated story, but it's possible now that we do have digitization. And so I know that Harvard's intellectual wealth is indeed being shared.
Por fim, as suas considerações finais.
Well, I would like to offer my sympathy and solidarity with people in Brazil. I love Brazil. I've been there 5 times on trips. I've given lectures in many parts of Brazil. I have a wonderful Brazilian publisher, Companhia das Letras. And so, thanks to Companhia das Letras, Louis Schwartz, its editor, I've got to know Brazilians and to develop a deep sympathy for you. You're going through very, very difficult times. We are too in the US, but Brazil's future is very complicated and uncertain. So I'm with you in my heart and I wish you well.
Robert Darnton, muito obrigado pela entrevista, muito obrigado pelo seu tempo, muito obrigado também ao público que está aqui nos acompanhando. Obrigado a todos, um abraço, tchau, tchau.